I've titled this discussion uh, after Aldous Huxley's great novel, Brave New World, Coronavirus, Big Government, and Brave New World. Huxley is a very interesting figure, and it must be noted that Huxley could not be called a conservative by any meaningful definition. But I've been reflecting on this book quite a lot lately. I read it probably like most of you. I read it in high school or college and don't know that I loved it at the time. But it would be a book like so many other classics that I was required to read in youth that I would gravitate back to and find, start mining the riches that I found there. Brave New World was written in 1931 and it was published in 1932, and it is a rebuttal in some sense. It's a parody of H.G. Wells's book Men Like Gods. Now you'll know the name H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds and the Time Machine, for which he's very famous. Wells had a very optimistic view of man, a very optimistic of science and progress. He was a very outspoken, aggressive atheist and Darwinist. And Huxley wrote this book, which is quite cynical about man and is quite cynical about science. And when Wells read it, he was a friend of Huxley's. When he read it, this is what he had to say. Brave New World was a great disappointment to me. I'll bet it was. A writer of the standing of Aldous Huxley has no right to betray the future as he did in that book. When thinking about the future, people seem to overlook the logical progress in education, in architecture, and in science. So here he is with this very optimistic view of science, this very optimistic view of man, this optimistic view of progress. And this is what has been called historicism, this idea that man is advancing from lower to higher in all forms. The world itself is, biology is, man is. He's becoming a much more sophisticated being. And Huxley, however, didn't share this chipper outlook of mankind or of science or the future. And as I say, though he was an atheist himself, Huxley was not an atheist like so many of those that I've engaged of this day and age. He wasn't a Peter Singer or a Richard Dawkins sort of atheist. He wasn't an atheist of the Michael Shermer sort. If anything, he was maybe more closely associated with a guy like Christopher Hitchens, but even there, much less so. He was much less optimistic about the future and of man, and much more honest in evaluating himself and his own atheism. Speaking of his atheism, he wrote in 1937, get this, he said, I had motives for not wanting the world to have a meaning, and consequently assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaningless was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. The supporters of this system claimed that it embodied the meaning, the Christian meaning, they insisted, of the world. There was one admirably simple method of confuting these people and justifying ourselves in our erotic revolt. We would deny that the world had any meaning whatsoever. Now, those are the words of Aldous Huxley in his book, Ends and Means, in 1937. It's so brutally honest in assessing his own worldview and why he chose it. He chose it essentially for emotional reasons. I wrote in 2013, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic titled Listening to Young Atheists. You can find this online. Still, it was a piece that went viral and had quite an impact on many churches around the world. because I essentially argued that the church was not communicating with the atheists in their midst. And furthermore, that atheists themselves were not choosing atheism for intellectual reasons, but they were rather looking for intellectual justification for a worldview that they had emotional attachment to. And this is essentially what Huxley himself is saying. He's saying this about himself, and yet as an older man, he's looking back and he sees that this is an unsatisfying worldview. He sees that it's a world that is broken and that is in much need of some kind of redemption. And the secular philosophies then on offer, again, 1932, were not ones that looked particularly promising, as they apparently seem to be to H.G. Wells. So this is between the two world wars, and Huxley, as I say, has written here a parody that became a novel in and of itself of Wells's Men Like Gods. The book itself is it's an easy read. It's sci-fi. It doesn't seem at the first glance to be particularly deep and philosophical, and yet a worldview is being expressed throughout. Now, for those of you who haven't read it, I will just acquaint you with a few of the major characters in the book, and with the world that he's dealing with, that he's describing. This is looking well into the future, and you have what is called the world state. You might call it the United Nations, and it governs the entire world, and each continent or region of the world is governed by controllers. But then there is these controllers each have enormous power. And the governor of Western Europe, the resident controller for Western Europe, is a man by the name of Mustafa Mond. Mustafa Mond, and Mustafa Mond is an antagonist in this. He is the intellectual. He's voicing, through him, Huxley is voicing all the secular ideologies and justifying them through him. Then we have a character by the name of John. And John is also referred to as the savage. He's a guy who lives in these regions that are spread throughout the world. They're reservations of sorts where the world state has left things in a kind of natural state, where in the world state itself, families have been wiped out. Birth is managed by the world state. It's controlled, as it were, in a test tube, effectively. And it has done away with all conventional norms as we currently know them. Certain ideas are antithetical to those today. They have through conditioning, through science, through Soma, a drug that people take. They have wiped out many diseases. They've wiped out problems of pain and these sorts of things. And yet on these reservations, which are really there mainly it seems as amusement for those who don't live in them, families still exist, and women still give birth to their children naturally. Things that seem absolutely disgusting to citizens of the world state. And John is a product of the world state. They refer to him as the savage. And then we have the director. He's someone who runs the London factory, as it were, where the children are produced and are conditioned. And Lenina, who is the love interest in this, and a man by the name of Bernard Marx. And you'll notice that they're given names like Lenin and Marx, and there are references to other figures. Benito Mussolini that name comes up through the novel, along with others. But throughout the novel, without going through the novel, I'll let you read the novel and get the entire plot line on your own. What interests me is this, and hence the reason I've been thinking about this novel quite a lot since this whole coronavirus pandemic began, because I thought, wow, Aldous Huxley, it sure seems to me, was way ahead of his time in predicting where he thought the world was going. And in this particular book, that's what he's doing, is he's making a prediction about where he sees the world going, in its worship of science, in its worship of orderliness, in its worship of elimination of pain. And he predicts through this novel that people will be controlled in a variety of ways. Now, before we get to that, let me say this. Some of you have possibly read Neil Postman's clever little book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Postman wrote the book, I think, in 1980. It's still very relevant. If you've never read Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, I encourage you to do so. It's a terrific book. But Postman, who was a professor of communications at the University of New York, or New York rather, University, he in that book is comparing the two worldviews, the two visions, the dystopian visions of the two great novels, this one, Huxley's Brave New World, and he's comparing it also to George Orwell's 1984. Now, you may think of those novels as essentially the same, but they aren't. They're actually quite different. Orwell's 1984 is more comparable to a more modern and less clever film called that's what it's called, I think, V for Vendetta, in which John Hurt appears in that, and it makes sense that he would, since he was in the film version of 1984. But 1984, in that particular novel, that's where we get the term Big Brother and doublespeak. It's this idea of a police state, and people are controlled through surveillance, and they are controlled through fear. Now, Postman argued that he didn't think that Orwell's vision was actually the vision that was winning out. He believed that it was Huxley's vision of the world that was winning out. Now, I would suggest to you, now that we're some 40 years on from Neil Postman's book, that it actually seems to me to be a little bit of both. When we go to, say, China, I've been in China, I've been in Taiwan. It saddens me what's going on in Taiwan. Excuse me, not Taiwan, Hong Kong. It saddens me what's going on there. I've been there no less than 7 times, and it has been a real model of democracy. And we're seeing the Chinese, assert their authority over that extraordinary city. But when you go throughout China, I would say that it's Orwell that's winning out in China. People are controlled through fear. They are controlled through surveillance. They are controlled through a strict regulation of the flow of information. That is what's happening there. And yet, I would agree with Postman that what we're seeing in the West is a little different than that. And that is Huxley's vision, that people would ultimately be controlled not so much through fear as they would be controlled through their pleasures, that people would willingly surrender their freedoms, that they would lay it at the altar of the state in exchange for the state taking away individual responsibility and taking away their fear, to provide for them. It's interesting because 2 Zoom meetings ago, we were discussing Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. And in the chapter, which we didn't discuss, we didn't have time to discuss, the chapter called The Grand Inquisitor. In The Grand Inquisitor, Ivan, one of the central characters in that novel, predicts, and again, this is a novel that was written in 1881 by a Russian, where there's virtually no technology, and certainly at the time, and took quite some time for it to make its way to Russia in the 20th century. But Ivan predicts that eventually, and of course we're really talking Dostoevsky, predicts that eventually people will choose safety over freedom. Now, I want you to think about that for just a moment. When we are thinking about coronavirus and pandemics, people would sacrifice their freedom in exchange for safety. They would surrender it to the state, but say, feed us, take care of us. So when we come back to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, this is what Huxley predicts. This is a vision that he sees coming. That the world controllers, that is the world state, as it's called in this novel, they would maintain control over the masses using a variety of methods. The first is controlling the birth process. They would have strict control of the birth process. And you get a glimpse of this in the first chapter of Brave New World, where the director is walking you through one of these facilities where children are born in a matrix kind of way. They're created in test tubes and whatnot, and their maturity, the maturity of the fetus is accelerated, and children are conditioned and so on. But they eliminate natural birth. Women don't give birth in the normal course of things, but rather this is all done through test tubes and whatnot. And then abortion is strongly encouraged. Women are encouraged to use birth control, required to use it. They're conditioned to use it. And so birth itself, the population is strictly controlled. So this is the first way, Huxley says. It'll be through control of the birth process. Then secondly, it's through conditioning, the conditioning of identities through what is referred to as hypnopedia. This is this idea, and I remember some years ago when I was working my way through college and was painting houses, I would listen to sports radio, and there was this advertisement for something called the Sleeping Genius. And the Sleeping Genius, clearly taken just right out of Brave New World, it was this headset that you wore when you were sleeping. And all you needed to do was put on the Sleeping Genius, and during your sleep, you would hear essentially the Cliff Notes versions of all the classics. And so went the commercial. Do you feel when you're at this or that dinner party that maybe your ability to carry a conversation is inadequate? Well, put on the Sleeping Genius. And when you're done, you'll be able to talk Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Faulkner and all the greats. Now, I don't know what dinner parties you're going to. Those are the dinner parties I would love to go to if that's what people actually talk about, but they don't. They're probably talking about things more like American Idol and football. The second one I actually enjoy talking about too. But the idea was that just in your sleep, you could put this headset on and you would learn all of the great classics. Well, this is what Huxley is talking about here. So people would be controlled through the birth process and then through the conditioning of identity. So you'll recall the world state's slogan is community, identity, stability. Community, identity, stability. And what Huxley says in the novel is these characters, they are all subjected rather, and mentally seduced, intellectually seduced by the conditioning, because while they're sleeping, they're hearing things that they like, and they're being conditioned to not like other things. So those people in this highly stratified society who are meant to be laborers are taught to dislike reading, and they are taught to dislike trips to the countryside, and they're taught to like gray and black and dingy colors, and they're taught to like being in their lane, as it were, and continuing to labor as they have been effectively bred to be. So controlling the birth process and then conditioning, conditioned to like their state. The third is Soma. Soma, it's a fictitious drug, but here we are. What are we now? We're 90 years, almost 89 years since this novel was written. And how many drugs are there that are on the market to make you feel better, to make you feel better about life? I recall at MIT some years ago, a lecturer, the chair of the Department of Psychology from Harvard University, giving a lecture. A man by the name of Jerome Kagan came and he gave a lecture, and this lecture was back in the 90s. But I remember him saying this that was very interesting. He said that pills, they were working now on pills that you would take that would make you feel no guilt. You would feel no guilt. And he said, imagine when a pill like that hits the market. He said it'll be the ruin of society as we know it. Because guilt, it can often be a very destructive and bad thing, but it can also be a very good thing. It can be something that the Holy Spirit, I believe, uses to stimulate us to repent, to seek reconciliation, to go to our God and seek His grace, to seek His mercy. It's something there that serves a purpose, much the same way that pain does. You fall and you hurt yourself and you feel no pain. I was watching an NFL documentary the other day, like so many of you. I'm watching just about everything in quarantine. And a player was talking about in the old days, back in the 60s and 70s, that a man injures himself during a game and they would just inject something into his knee or his hip or wherever he's injured so that he felt no pain. Now, on the surface, this seems like a good thing, but it's a terrible thing, because he said you would go back into a game and you would play and you would feel good, and then later you'd find out that you had totally destroyed your knee because you didn't feel the pain. You didn't know this was happening to you. So Huxley says that he's predicting that drugs will be developed to make you feel better about yourself, to take away from you the pain that you feel from the pain of responsibility, the emotional pain, physical pain, from thinking, from feeling angst about situations. This will all be taken care of through drugs. And the world state creates them as a replacement, say, for alcohol. They don't want people doing things that are destructive to them in the physical sense. So the world state provides to the citizens Soma, a little blue pill. Then the fourth means of controlling a population, says Huxley, is the promotion of pleasure and indulgence. And this comes right back to Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. That's what he means by the title. We're reaching a place where we are amusing ourselves to death, where we're losing the ability to engage thoughtfully with books, with culture, with our surroundings, and with each other. I saw a couple of days ago somebody, it's a celebrity who follows me on Twitter, and I suddenly can't remember her name, but I saw that she had tweeted, do any of you have a problem with your children FaceTiming you from another part of the house? And amusing as that is, it's also a glimpse of where our culture is, what technology has done, and where it has taken us. And this is Postman's argument, that it is through pleasure and it is through technology, another little book of his called Technopoly, which is still relevant, that it has taken us to a place where our lives are so regulated and so controlled by technology and by the pleasure that technology gives us. You know, we're looking at our phones constantly. We are not engaging with each other, but are rather always engaging something else. And this is all part of the world state's plan, according to the book. If those of you who have read it or read it more recently will recall that the state required people not to spend time alone. You weren't to be alone. You're to be with other people. When do some of our best thoughts come to us? It's often when we're alone. It's often when we are alone with our thoughts. It's often in those wee hours of the night just before you fall asleep, or maybe while you're laying awake, that you reflect on your day and you begin reflecting on the more meaningful things in your life, and it can move you to action. That might be reconciliation, it might be repentance, it might mean some major change in your life. But here, the world state, Soma, is meant to remove that, and you're not to spend any time alone. and you're supposed to spend time going to the movies that they provide, enjoying the activities that they provide, never being alone, because that means being alone with your thoughts. The fifth way that people would be controlled by the state, says Huxley, is through the removal of pain. The removal of pain, physical, emotional, and that which comes with the freedom and responsibility of making choices. Now, some of you are so used to your freedom and you're used to the pain that comes with it that you don't think much about that. But the reality is that freedom does bring with it a certain measure of pain. And not necessarily physical pain, but it brings with it a kind of stress that is associated with responsibility. You know, good parents, you're trying to raise your children to a place where they are able to make choices for themselves, where they are free agents, where they are thinking for themselves, and they are moving through life making increasingly more important choices. It may start with what they want to wear in the morning or what they eat at breakfast, but it ultimately comes choices like where they want to go to college and what they want to do with their lives and who they want to marry and where they want to go to work, and questions like this. And it's a process to teach your children, to train them for this kind of responsibility, for these kinds of choices. Freedom brings with it responsibility. It also brings with it risks. We accept those risks, increasingly less, but we do accept those risks. We understand that if I'm sitting here in this flat in downtown Birmingham, I suppose I'm safer here. The moment I walk out into the street and then I get into an automobile or I get on a bike, and trust me, I know about this, there are risks that I'm assuming with that. I could be in an automobile accident. I could find myself in an unhappy lawsuit. I could find myself in any number of situations because freedom brings with it risks, and we assume those risks. But Huxley says people will willingly surrender their freedom. They'll willingly surrender their choices and their responsibility because ultimately they don't want them. And this is, again, Dostoevsky's prediction. At the end, people will say, well, you make all the choices. You tell us what to do. You tell us what you want us to be, but take care of us. Assume those responsibilities for us. And I would maintain, by the way, that the Democrats, throughout this coronavirus pandemic, part of the objective that many of them have, I won't say all of them, but certainly some of them, has been to create increased reliance on the state. The longer that people are quarantined and can't work for themselves, the longer they are not getting paychecks, and the more they will need to have income coming from somewhere. And instead of looking to their friends or their family or perhaps their churches, they look to the state. And once you're dependent upon the state, it is perhaps more than a little likely that you'll become increasingly dependent upon the state for a very long time. These are issues that Huxley is dealing with in this novel. And then finally, there is this, and we don't get this really until we have that big showdown, the great conversation that takes place. It begins in chapter 16, which is a conversation between John the Savage and the world controller, Mustafa Mond. And again, Mustafa Mond represents the worst government elite. This is Nancy Pelosi. And on the other hand, John is a man who has loved his freedom. He has read broadly because he was raised in the reservation, not in the world state. And he's a man who knows what it is to experience freedom, but also what it is to experience physical and emotional pain and the suffering that comes with those choices, because we don't always make wise choices. And the two of them have this big discussion towards the end of the book, and they're talking about God. And Huxley, this is again very curious to me because, as I say, Aldous Huxley was himself an atheist. But he has I think God would be pleased with the way he's represented by Huxley in this book. Huxley does a fair job of arguing his side of the question. And Huxley here says that that in the end people will be controlled because the idea of God will be suppressed and it will be replaced with an alternate idea of community. Now, this is very interesting to me because, again, this book was written in 31. It was published in 32. And the word community is used throughout the book. The world state is always telling people that they must do what is best for the community. It's this idea we are in this together. People, they are told, do not own themselves. They all own each other. And this includes their sexuality. This includes work. This includes anything. There's no sense of privacy. There's no sense of self-ownership or self-determination. Everything is done for the best of the state. And hence, the idea of God is suppressed. And with that, the idea of individual value is also suppressed. You can't have a world in which people are seen as being objects of special creation if there is no special creator. If at the end of the day we are not created, but are instead products of random chance and necessity, the idea of human value goes out. I've argued this many times, and I'm not unique in making this argument, but it's one that has to continually be made because we live in a society that's so deeply influenced by the Christian ethos that even many atheists do not realize that their own moral sensibilities have come from a Christian ethic of which they've deeply inhaled without receiving the Christian God. But once that goes out, once that ethos is no longer there, we will have a whole different kind of atheists that we're dealing with, who are much more consistent in living with that worldview. And that worldview says that human beings have no more value than any other animal on the face of the earth. You have this line in the book: murder kills only the individual. And after all, what is an individual? With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one with the greatest of ease, as many as we like. So Huxley is telling you that once the idea of God goes out the window, the idea of human worth goes out with it. And this is highly problematic because it means human beings in the end have no more value than any other animal on the face of the earth. So the idea of God is suppressed. And he says the idea of God is suppressed, the world controller does, because he says the idea of God is inconsistent with control and with happiness. We don't want a God like that. We don't want it. And so that idea is suppressed. Now, bringing us to a discussion of coronavirus and big government. So I want to be clear that I'm not a guy who, I'm trained academically, and I just as a rule don't buy into conspiracy theories. I'm of the view Benjamin Franklin made the statement that 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. And as a historian, I've often said, don't believe conspiracy theories unless they involve Russians, in which case they might be true. But the idea of some vast global conspiracy and so forth is not something that I tend to buy into. That said, I do believe that there are those who have ideas that run antithetical to a Christian worldview and run antithetical to the ideas contained in the Constitution of the United States, which certainly has its roots in a Christian worldview. And for those of you who are not, I know we have many of you listening from around the world who are not Americans. So let me just simply say this: ideas that are antithetical to freedom, to values that many of us would hold dear. And they're determined to push those ideas in a very big way. And Huxley is predicting this. And I think that in the world that we currently live in, I think we are seeing a lot of what Huxley has predicted 90 years ago in this novel. 90 years ago, we're already seeing any number of these ideas. This idea of controlling education, the conditioning, we've seen that. Controlling the birth process, we've seen that. I mean, the government in the United States gives tens of millions of dollars to Planned Parenthood, which is a death factory. There's no other way of putting it. It's referred to as healthcare. It isn't healthcare. It is a factory and agency of death. Even as many of you will know, even as quarantines were being enforced strictly in places like, say, Michigan, New York, and California, Planned Parenthood was allowed to stay open. It was deemed to be essential. So controlling the birth process, we've seen that. The conditioning through education, we've seen that. Through drugs, we've seen that. Not necessarily all part of a big government push, but certainly things that all kind of work together. And if you read an article that I published earlier this year, based on a conversation with a Harvard researcher by the name of Robert Epstein, then you know what Google is doing, and that Google is working in a lot of these areas through what are called ephemeral experiences. That is to say, through internet searches in order to control human behavior and even to determine the outcome of elections. You'll find this on the Full Fathom 5 blog, on my blog, the LarryAlexTaunton.com website. You'll find that there, and you can read what Epstein has to say. He was also recently on Tucker Carlson, so you might have seen him on there, in which he was talking about coronavirus and so forth. The idea of God has been suppressed, and but where I particularly find the novel speaking to our own time is in this idea of the removal of pain. Something has not set well with me regarding the quarantine. Now, I should say this. I'm not one of these people who is out on the street in confrontation with the police and is seeking confrontation. And in fact, I originally supported the quarantines. I believe that the quarantines early on were necessary until such time as we knew what we were dealing with and until data could begin to come in. Since that time, however, we've begun to see a Brave New World-like patterns begin to show themselves in, my wife and I, we were stuck in Spain for a time when this pandemic began. It was very interesting to me how in the lockdown there, and they made everyone stay indoors. You were not allowed to come outside. And here we are in Spain, and police are driving through the streets with loudspeakers, telling everyone you must stay inside or you will be fined. And there I did ultimately find myself in a confrontation with police. Fortunately, I wasn't arrested because there were reasons that you had to go out. And we were being pushed out of our hotel because all such places were being closed. We had to find some other place to stay until we could find a flight home. Flights were being canceled. And it was interesting to me how rapidly the police went within a few days. Initially, the quarantines were enforced with a velvet glove. The police were friendly and were helpful, but within days, you saw how people given this much authority were wielding it like a whip, and in absolutely unreasonable ways. And then we come back to the States and we begin to see that same process begin to happen here. It happened there much more rapidly because the virus spread there much more rapidly. And Spain was a hotspot, as was France, and I was stuck in France and also in Africa. You don't want to travel with me. And we were seeing all of this in all of these places, and how fear gripped the populations because they had access to BBC, they had access to CNN, and it was just, I don't have to tell you, it was just a constant wave of frightening information and of death tolls and so on. Imagine if all 40,000 traffic accidents in the United States were covered with the same kind of play-by-play, painstaking detail that the coronavirus pandemic has been covered. Every accident, somebody is on the scene to say that if there had been photos of my accident and someone there reporting, he has 19 broken vertebrae, his jaw is shattered, he's back of his skull is fractured, his face is fractured, he's broken X number of bones, you would never get on a bike again. You would never go in the street again if you had seen my accident. Imagine the same kind of reporting on cancer, on deaths through. I just happened to notice the other day I was using a ladder on my house to do some painting, and it had this detail on there. It said that the number one reason that people go to emergency rooms is falling off of ladders, and it was a crazy number. It was tens of thousands of people who every year go to the emergency room, and many of them dying from injuries suffered from accidents, and yet that's never covered. That's never stated. Stay off ladders or hire someone else to handle that for you. So I found this idea of the removal of pain, the idea that we will sacrifice our freedom for safety, to be particularly relevant for the time in which we live. Because what we're hearing now is there has become this false dichotomy. Either you're for quarantine, and thus you're for the community, you're for society, you're for safety, you're for what is right, or you want to kill grandma. I mean, that's kind of what it is. You're on one side, or if you are on the other and you think, gosh, I really do need to earn a living, and I think it should be my choice if I should take risks, and I need to get out and get to work, well, you're spoken of in the worst kind of terms. The governor of Georgia, according to the Atlantic, when he decided to reopen his state, they ran a headline that said that it was a practice in, quote, human sacrifice. Human sacrifice. I mean, this is just insane. But I would suggest to you that it's not just simply an effort to frighten people. What we're seeing is a clash of worldviews. You see, I don't believe that this life is all there is. My wife, my lovely wife sitting off to my left, she doesn't believe that this life is all there is. We are willing to assume certain risks and certain responsibilities, not because we think the coronavirus isn't real, or automobile accidents aren't real, or that cancer isn't real, or Ebola isn't real, but because we are assuming the responsibility because there's something of quality of life. There are things that we value more than merely our health. And if by some chance either of us should be confronted with our own demise as a result of our everyday activities, we accept that. There is another world, there is eternity, there is Jesus Christ, and we will meet again. We're not looking to accelerate that process by doing silly things, but we do assume a certain level of risk. However, if I believe that this life is all there is, if I believe, as Huxley's pointing out in Brave New World, that the people are taught that this world is all there is, then maybe I think there's nothing that's really worth dying for, and I'm not willing to take risks. And so we're definitely seeing that in this pandemic. Now, I want to give you the opportunity to raise your hand and ask questions. And hopefully this thing doesn't shut down, because I know we had set it up to 7:35, so maybe it does. I don't know if it runs over or not. I haven't done Zoom enough. This is the third time I've even used it. But if you have a question, I know there are means of raising your hand, and we will unmute you, and you can ask me some questions. You know, it's funny, I don't see the comments on section. I normally do. I'm going to, all of you, be very careful here. What you have going on in your own homes, but I'm going to go unmute, and if need be, I will mute again. Okay, any questions for me? You have been unmuted, and you can ask me questions.
Larry, can you hear
Yes,
me?
yes, I can.
Okay. What about other people and our responsibility to their welfare? Shouldn't that be part of our concerns and freedom?
The man that I'm speaking to right now, ladies and gentlemen, is a physician, a recently retired physician, and so he brings those very good questions to the table. You know, Bo, I can only speak for
Let me
myself,
ask
but
you,
I will tell you
let
what
me ask
Lori
you
and
a
I
medical school
have done.
question.
I'm going to go mute all again while I answer the
Let me
question.
ask you a medical school question.
Um, I will only answer for ourselves. Lori, now my mother is a diabetic. She's in her late 70s, and she would fall into the category of vulnerable. We have kept a very close eye on her. I'm grateful for the fact that she frequently calls me and says, "Hey, could I or should I do this?" My answer is usually no. We often take food to her, and when she has visited us, we require that she wears a mask and that she keeps her distance. We sit outside at some distance from her. My daughter Sasha, who many of you will know from the Grace Effect, Sasha was adopted at the age of 11. She was born HIV positive because she inherited it from her biological mother. And that, by very definition, makes Sasha vulnerable. We kept her with my mother for 2 months until Sasha's own physicians told us, maybe 10 days ago, that she was safe to come home. They felt like she was fine. So that's my response to that, Bo. I think that we make decisions on a case-by-case basis, and what you believe is the right thing to do. But this again kind of gets to one of the issues of this book, and that is those are choices I think we make. I think those are choices that my mother makes at the end of the day. What she chooses to do, she may choose to disregard what I say or the CDC or anyone else. And then from my point of view, I believe she has that right to do that because that's what freedom looks like. Other questions? I don't know if the hand raising feature is working or not, but. Okay, so raise your hand if you have a question. Somehow there's some way for you to do that, and then we unmute you, and you can ask a question. I'm being texted by my tech people. Do not unmute all people. So I won't do that anymore. I think I catch maybe some of you in the bathroom or something like that. But if somebody raises a hand, then we can respond to you. Well, until someone does, until there is a question, and there may not be any more questions, but we will certainly look for them. Let me just simply say this. Again, if you haven't read it, I would strongly encourage you to read. And listen, many of you are looking for things to do. I would go and read Brave New World. It's not that big. It's not that hard to read. It's a very easy read. And then I would read Orwell's 1984. Again, not a really big read. And then the easiest of them all, and equally clever, is the much more modern Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, in which he compares the two. And he argues that that it is Huxley's vision that it is winning out, not Orwell's vision. It's not that we will be controlled through fear, it's that you'll be controlled through Netflix. It'll be that you will voluntarily surrender. And think about this, this is so true. How many of you have voluntarily surrendered your privacy, have voluntarily surrendered your information to Google, to Apple, because you say it really doesn't matter and you really don't care? It should matter. You should care. It should matter to you, as Robert Epstein has argued that Google has no less than 3 million pages on the average Google user who has been using Google for the last 15 or 20 years, knowing everything about you and monetizing it. But these are things that are quite creepy. And it isn't like Google is requiring you, or the state is requiring you to give away that information. It's that you're choosing to do it. And this is Huxley's argument. People will choose to give away their freedom. They'll choose to give away their privacy, and they will sacrifice it for the sake of convenience, for the sake of pleasure, and for the sake of safety.